Most people do not think carefully about what happens to the brain between the moment they stop being productive and the moment they fall asleep. That window, which typically lasts between 15 and 30 minutes, is treated as dead time, a transition, something to pass through on the way to rest. That assumption is one of the most costly cognitive mistakes a person can make on a daily basis. The brain does not switch off when the body stops moving. It does not enter a neutral holding state while sleep approaches. What it does is something far more consequential. It begins consolidating the day's most emotionally and cognitively prominent experiences into long-term memory structures. It strengthens the neural pathways most recently and most frequently activated. It processes unresolved problems using associative reasoning that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. And it sets the default cognitive tone, the baseline orientation of attention, expectation, and behavioral readiness that will govern the first several hours of the following day. In short, the brain is doing some of its most important organizational work precisely during the period most people spend scrolling through their phones, ruminating on the day's frustrations, or simply waiting passively for sleep to arrive. This matters for a straightforward reason. The inputs that enter the brain during this consolidation window have a disproportionate influence on what gets strengthened, what gets stored, and what gets carried forward as automatic pattern. Whatever cognitive and emotional content is most present during the pre-sleep window receives preferential processing. It gets reinforced. It becomes slightly more automatic, slightly more accessible, slightly more default. Do this every night with unmanaged, negative, or scattered mental content, and the brain gradually builds more efficient pathways for exactly that kind of thinking. Do it consistently with structured, purposeful, directed cognitive content, and the brain builds pathways for that instead. This is not a philosophical claim. It is a description of how memory consolidation, neural reinforcement, and habit formation actually work at a biological level. What follows is a systematic examination of the specific cognitive habits that, when practiced consistently in the pre-sleep window, have the strongest documented influence on behavioral performance, decision quality, mental clarity, and the sustained pursuit of defined goals. These are not motivational suggestions. They are behavioral strategies derived from what research in cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and performance science has established about how the brain forms and maintains the patterns that govern daily conduct. Each habit will be examined in full: what it is, why it works at a mechanistic level, what happens in its absence, and how to implement it practically in the specific conditions of the pre-sleep period. The goal is not inspiration. The goal is a working understanding of a cognitive system that, applied consistently, produces measurable improvements in the quality of thinking, the reliability of effort, and the coherence of behavior over time. The problem of an unanchored mind. The human brain has a well-documented tendency to default to threat monitoring in the absence of active direction. When the conscious mind is not engaged with a specific task or problem, the default mode network, a set of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, mental time travel, and social cognition, becomes dominant. In everyday experience, this is the mental state most people recognize as mind-wandering. Thoughts move without direction. Attention drifts between past events, future worries, social comparisons, and unresolved concerns. During the active hours of the day, external demands, work tasks, conversations, decisions, physical activities, continuously interrupt this default state and redirect attention toward specific content. The mind is pulled out of its natural drift repeatedly by the demands of the environment. In the pre-sleep period, those external demands disappear. The environment becomes quiet. Physical demands cease. And for most people, the default mode network moves immediately into dominance, producing exactly the kind of unmanaged mental drift that is least useful for the consolidation process about to begin. The cognitive consequence is significant. When the brain consolidates a night of unanchored pre-sleep thinking, it strengthens the neural architecture of scattered attention, threat monitoring, and reactive emotional processing. Over time, these patterns become more automatic, more easily triggered, less easily interrupted, more deeply embedded in the behavioral defaults that govern daily conduct. What cognitive anchoring does. Cognitive anchoring is the deliberate practice of fixing the mind on a specific, clearly defined objective before sleep, not as a passive thought, but as an active cognitive act of precision and commitment. The neurological function of this practice is direct. When the brain is given a specific, well-defined target to hold during the pre-sleep period, the default mode network's unstructured activity is displaced by goal-oriented processing. The brain's prefrontal regions, associated with planning, intentional behavior, and self-regulation, maintain a degree of engagement that shapes what gets prioritized in the consolidation process that follows. Research on goal-directed cognition consistently shows that clearly defined objectives held in active awareness before sleep influence the content and direction of memory consolidation during the subsequent sleep cycle. Problems associated with specific goals receive preferential processing during slow-wave and REM sleep stages. Relevant information from the day's experience is more likely to be connected, integrated, and stored in ways that support the goal than information with no clear goal association. In behavioral terms, this means that a person who consistently anchors their pre-sleep cognition to a specific, well-defined objective wakes with a cognitive orientation more closely aligned with that objective than a person who entered sleep without that anchor. Their attention the following morning is more likely to register relevant information. Their decision-making is more likely to be evaluated against the defined goal. Their behavioral choices are more likely to reflect purposeful direction rather than reactive response to whatever demands most immediate attention. The specificity requirement. The effectiveness of cognitive anchoring depends critically on specificity. A vague objective, I want to be more successful, I want to improve my situation, does not produce the same neurological effect as a precisely defined one. Vague goals do not activate the goal-directed processing systems with the same efficiency as specific ones because the brain cannot organize associative processing around an undefined target. The difference can be understood through a simple analogy. A search algorithm given a precise query returns relevant results efficiently. The same algorithm given a vague query returns a broad, largely irrelevant set of results. The brain's associative processing during sleep works similarly. A specific, well-defined objective gives the processing system a precise target. A vague one does not. Specificity means defining the objective in concrete, measurable terms. Not a better career, but a specific role, skill set, or professional outcome within a defined time frame. Not more financial stability, but a specific financial target with a specific strategy being pursued. Not improved health, but a specific behavioral change being implemented with specific metrics of progress. The act of formulating this level of specificity is itself cognitively valuable, independent of its effect on sleep processing. The discipline of forcing vague ambition into precise definition consistently reveals the gap between what a person says they want and what they have actually committed to pursuing. A gap that, once visible, can be addressed directly rather than generating the low-level cognitive friction that vague ambition without commitment reliably produces. Implementation. In the final 15 to 20 minutes before sleep, take the primary goal currently being pursued and state it internally with as much precision as possible. Include the specific outcome being sought, the current stage of progress, and the specific next action that advances it. Do not allow this to become a review of how far away the goal appears. The cognitive function being performed here is orientation, not evaluation. The brain is being given a precise target to organize its processing around, not a problem to solve through worry. If the mind drifts toward other concerns during this practice, which it will, particularly in the early stages of building the habit, redirect it without self-criticism. The redirection itself is the practice. Each act of noticing the drift and returning to the anchor strengthens the attentional control pathways that make goal-directed thinking progressively more automatic. Practiced consistently, this single habit produces a measurable shift in the cognitive tone of mornings. The direction of attention upon waking becomes less reactive and more purposeful. The first decisions of the day are more likely to reflect deliberate orientation toward the defined objective rather than default response to immediate environmental demands. How emotional state affects memory consolidation. Memory consolidation during sleep is not emotionally neutral. The brain does not process all experiences equally during the overnight consolidation cycle. It applies a prioritization system in which emotional valence, the positive or negative emotional charge associated with an experience, plays a significant role in determining what gets strengthened and what gets attenuated. Experiences associated with strong negative emotion receive high-priority consolidation. This is an evolutionarily ancient mechanism. The brain prioritizes the retention of threatening or aversive experiences because, historically, failing to remember dangerous situations had more severe survival consequences than failing to remember neutral ones. The result is that negative experiences, particularly those associated with fear, shame, failure, or social threat, are disproportionately well-remembered and disproportionately influential on subsequent behavior. This biological prioritization mechanism, which served a useful function in environments where physical threats were the primary survival challenge, creates a significant problem in the context of modern goal-directed behavior. It means that a person who enters sleep in a state of elevated negative emotion, anxiety about performance, rumination over a mistake, resentment toward a colleague, fear about a financial situation, will have those experiences consolidated more deeply and with greater behavioral influence than the experiences associated with progress, competence, and purposeful effort that also occurred during the same day. The behavioral consequence accumulates over time. The brain becomes progressively more efficient at producing anxiety, rumination, and threat monitoring because those are the states being most consistently consolidated and strengthened. The neural pathways associated with them become more established, more automatically triggered, and more resistant to interruption. The mechanism of emotional reappraisal. Emotional reappraisal is a cognitive strategy with extensive research support in clinical and performance psychology. It involves the deliberate reinterpretation of an emotionally charged experience in a way that modifies its emotional valence without denying its factual content. This is not a technique for avoiding the honest acknowledgement of negative experiences. It is a technique for preventing a fixed, unconstructive emotional interpretation of those experiences from being the dominant input to the consolidation process. The practical application involves a specific cognitive shift, moving from an experience-focused interpretation. This went badly. I performed poorly. This situation is threatening, to an information-focused interpretation. This experience revealed a specific gap in my approach. This outcome tells me something specific about what needs to change. This difficulty is identifying a problem that can be addressed. The distinction matters neurologically because the two interpretations, while describing the same factual event, produce different emotional states. The experience-focused interpretation sustains the negative emotional charge of the event, keeping the threat response systems active and ensuring that the consolidation process strengthens the associated negative patterns. The information-focused interpretation reduces the emotional charge without eliminating the cognitive content of the experience, allowing the brain to process the relevant information, what went wrong, what can be learned, what adjustment is needed, without simultaneously reinforcing the anxiety and self-critical patterns associated with the emotionally amplified version. Practical regulation techniques. Several specific techniques have research support for producing pre-sleep emotional state regulation effectively. The first is structured written review. Research on expressive writing consistently shows that the act of writing about emotionally charged experiences in a structured, analytical way, focusing on what happened, what can be learned, and what specific adjustment is warranted, reduces the emotional activation associated with those experiences more effectively than either suppression or unstructured rumination. A brief written review of the day, conducted before sleep and focused on extracting useful information from difficult experiences rather than replaying them emotionally, produces a measurable reduction in pre-sleep cognitive arousal. The second technique is prospective focus, the deliberate shift of cognitive attention from past events to future actions. Rather than processing the day's difficulties from a retrospective position, shift to a prospective one. What specific action tomorrow addresses the problem identified today? This shift accomplishes two functions simultaneously. It reduces the emotional charge of the past event by recontextualizing it as information that has already been acted upon rather than as an unresolved threat. And it plants a specific behavioral intention for the following day that the brain will process during the consolidation cycle, increasing the likelihood that the intention will translate into actual behavior. The third technique is a structured gratitude or competence review, not as a feel-good exercise, but as a deliberate counterbalance to the brain's natural negativity bias. Identifying 2 or 3 specific experiences from the day that involve competent behavior, productive effort, or genuine progress, and holding these in deliberate attention before sleep, ensures that the consolidation process has access to positive experience inputs alongside the negative ones, preventing the systematic underconsolidation of competence and progress that occurs when negative emotional states dominate the pre-sleep period entirely. The behavioral function of self-concept. Self-concept, the collection of beliefs a person holds about their own identity, capabilities, and characteristic behaviors, functions as one of the most powerful regulators of actual behavior, not because of any abstract psychological dynamic, but because of a very specific and well-documented cognitive mechanism. The brain continuously monitors behavior for consistency with self-concept and generates discomfort when behavior deviates from it. This consistency monitoring function means that self-concept effectively sets a behavioral floor and ceiling. Behaviors that fall below the self-concept generate the discomfort of self-inconsistency, which motivates correction upward. Behaviors that exceed the self-concept generate a different kind of discomfort, the cognitive dissonance of acting in a way that does not feel like who you are, which motivates correction downward. The practical implication is that a person cannot sustainably behave significantly better than their self-concept describes them. They can make exceptional efforts on high motivation days. They can maintain elevated performance when external accountability is high or when inspiration is fresh. But in the absence of those temporary elevating factors, on ordinary days, in routine situations, when no one is watching and motivation is neither high nor low, behavior gravitates back toward whatever the self-concept describes as normal. This is the mechanism behind the frustrating pattern most people experience when attempting behavioral change. Significant improvement during an initial motivated period, followed by gradual regression toward previous patterns. The regression is not weakness or failure of willpower. It is the consistency monitoring system doing exactly what it is designed to do, pulling behavior back into alignment with a self-concept that has not yet been updated to reflect the new behavioral standard. Changing behavior sustainably therefore requires changing the self-concept that regulates it. And changing self-concept requires the same mechanism through which it was originally formed: repeated experience and habitually delivered self-relevant information. How self-concept forms and how it changes. Self-concept is not formed through occasional dramatic experiences, though such experiences can have significant impact. It is formed primarily through the accumulated weight of repeated, ordinary, self-relevant experiences and the habitual interpretations applied to them. A person who repeatedly experiences themselves as someone who starts things and does not finish them, and who habitually interprets this pattern as a stable characteristic rather than a changeable behavior, develops a self-concept that includes unreliability as a defining feature. Once that feature is established, the consistency monitoring system begins making it progressively more automatic. The brain generates less resistance to quitting because quitting has become self-consistent. The friction of persistence increases because persistence has become self-inconsistent. The same mechanism operates in the opposite direction. A person who repeatedly experiences themselves completing what they start, and who deliberately interprets this pattern as evidence of a reliable, persistent identity, builds a self-concept that includes reliability as a defining feature. Over time, quitting becomes self-inconsistent and therefore neurologically uncomfortable, while completing becomes self-consistent and therefore neurologically easier. The critical point is that the interpretation applied to experience is as important as the experience itself in shaping self-concept. Two people can have the same behavioral track record and form significantly different self-concepts from it, depending on the habitual interpretive lens they apply. The pre-sleep window for self-concept work. The pre-sleep period is a particularly effective window for deliberate self-concept reinforcement for the same reason it is effective for other forms of cognitive conditioning. The reduced activity of the analytical, critical, argumentative functions of the conscious mind allows self-relevant information to be received with less filtering and more depth. During the active day, self-referential statements are immediately subjected to critical evaluation. A person who says internally, "I am disciplined and focused," immediately generates a counterargument from the critical function. "But you were distracted this morning. But you did not complete yesterday's task. But you have said this before, and it did not last." This critical counterargument reduces the depth to which the self-referential statement can penetrate into the habitual self-concept. In the quiet of the pre-sleep period, the critical counterargument is less forceful. The same self-referential statement, delivered with genuine attention and emotional engagement, meets less internal resistance and can therefore be absorbed more effectively into the habitual self-concept structure. The specific content of this practice matters considerably. Effective self-concept reinforcement is not the repetition of flattering fictions. It is the deliberate, consistent emphasis of the identity characteristics that are being behaviorally cultivated, stated as present-tense descriptions rather than future aspirations, because present-tense descriptions engage the consistency monitoring system more effectively than future-tense ones. Statements such as, "I am someone who follows through on commitments. I approach problems with patience and analytical thinking. I maintain focus on my primary objective even when distraction is available. I make decisions based on clear criteria and commit to them." These are not descriptions of a perfect performance record. They are descriptions of the behavioral identity being built, the identity that, when sufficiently internalized, the consistency monitoring system will begin actively enforcing. Paired with the evening review of actual behavioral evidence, specific instances from the day in which these identity characteristics were expressed, however briefly or partially. This practice creates a compounding reinforcement cycle in which both the self-concept and the behavioral evidence supporting it are simultaneously being strengthened. The cognitive cost of unresolved decisions. The human brain maintains a continuous background processing load associated with unresolved decisions, open questions, and incomplete tasks. This phenomenon, studied extensively under the framework of the Zeigarnik effect and related cognitive load research, describes the brain's tendency to keep unfinished cognitive business active in working memory, allocating ongoing processing resources to it until it reaches resolution. During the active hours of the day, This background processing of unresolved items generates the subjective experience of being mentally busy, of having things to get back to, of a continuous low-level pressure associated with the awareness of incomplete business. Most people become habituated to this state and barely register it consciously. But its cognitive cost is real. It occupies working memory capacity that would otherwise be available for focused attention, creative thinking, and complex problem-solving. In the pre-sleep period, this background processing does not stop. The unresolved decisions, the open questions, the incomplete tasks that were carried through the day continue demanding processing resources. And because the external demands that were partially managing this background load during the day have now disappeared, the unresolved items often intensify in subjective prominence rather than fading. This is why many people find that problems and concerns feel more pressing at night than during the day, not because they are more serious, but because the competing cognitive demands that were suppressing them during the day are no longer present. The neurological consequence for sleep is significant. An elevated background cognitive load associated with unresolved decisions maintains a higher level of physiological arousal than a resolved, cognitively clear mental state. This arousal interferes directly with the quality of sleep onset and the depth of early sleep stages, reducing the effectiveness of the consolidation processes that make pre-sleep cognitive work productive. Beyond the sleep quality impact, unresolved decisions carried into sleep tend to be processed through the consolidation cycle in ways that maintain rather than resolve their unresolved status. The brain rehearses the open question without necessarily reaching a conclusion, which means the person wakes the next morning with the same unresolved load they carried into sleep, often feeling slightly more fatigued than they should be relative to the hours of sleep obtained. The resolution protocol. The practical response to this problem is a structured pre-sleep decision resolution practice, a deliberate cognitive sweep of the unresolved items carried from the day, conducted with the specific goal of bringing each item to a defined status before sleep. This does not mean that all decisions must be made before sleep. Some decisions genuinely cannot be made before sleep because they require information, conversation, or deliberation that is not currently available. The goal is not premature decision-making. The goal is the elimination of the cognitive load associated with unresolved items by bringing each one to a defined status, which may be a final decision, or may be a precisely defined next step toward making the decision, or may be a conscious, explicit deferral to a specific future point. The distinction between a consciously defined deferral and an unresolved item is significant. An unresolved item continues demanding processing resources because the brain interprets its open status as a task in progress. A consciously defined deferral. I will address this specific question at this specific point using this specific approach. Completes the cognitive task by providing a resolution pathway, even though the final decision has not yet been made. The brain's working memory releases the item from active processing because the next step has been defined. The practice is straightforward. Before sleep, conduct a brief mental sweep of the primary concerns, decisions, and incomplete tasks associated with the current period of work and life. For each item identified, determine its current status. Has it been resolved, or does it require further action? For unresolved items, define the specific next action and the specific point at which that action will be taken. If the decision cannot be advanced without information currently unavailable, define specifically what information is needed and how it will be obtained. Then consciously set the item aside with the understanding that it has been addressed to the extent currently possible. This practice, conducted regularly, produces a measurable improvement in the cognitive clarity of the pre-sleep period, reducing the background arousal associated with unresolved cognitive load and creating the conditions for more effective sleep and more directed thinking in the morning hours. The function of written offloading. Research on cognitive offloading, The use of external systems to reduce working memory load consistently shows that the act of writing down unresolved items, decisions, and planned actions reduces the brain's tendency to maintain active background processing on those items. The brain appears to respond to the creation of an external record as partial completion of the associated cognitive task, reducing the urgency of maintaining the item in active working memory. A brief written list of the primary concerns and planned next actions from the evening decision resolution practice, therefore, serves a dual function. It provides the cognitive offloading benefit of reducing background processing load, and it creates an external record that reduces the cognitive effort required to reconstruct the day's unfinished business the following morning, improving the efficiency of the transition back into directed work. This does not need to be elaborate. A brief written note of the 3 to 5 primary items that were consciously resolved or deferred during the evening review, along with the specific next action defined for each, takes less than 5 minutes and produces a cognitive environment considerably more conducive to restorative sleep than the alternative of carrying an unstructured load of unresolved items into the night. Implementation intentions and behavioral follow-through. One of the most replicated findings in behavioral psychology research is the implementation intention effect, the consistent finding that the probability of a person actually performing a planned behavior increases significantly when they specify in advance not only what they intend to do, but when, where, and how they will do it. The mechanism is well understood. A vague behavioral intention, "I will work on this tomorrow," exists as an abstract plan that requires active recall and motivational effort to translate into action when the relevant moment arrives. An implementation intention, "I will spend the first 90 minutes after waking at my desk working on this specific task before opening any communication channels," creates a specific stimulus-response link in memory. When this situation arises, I will perform this action. This stimulus-response link operates more automatically than the vague intention because it connects the behavior to a specific environmental cue rather than relying on conscious recall and motivational mobilization. The pre-sleep period is a highly effective time for forming implementation intentions because the reduced cognitive activity of the pre-sleep state allows the intention to be encoded with less interference from competing thoughts and plans. The brain processes the specific behavioral plan during the subsequent consolidation cycle, strengthening the neural associations between the environmental cues specified in the intention and the behavioral response associated with them. The practical implication is direct. Before sleep, define tomorrow's primary behavioral intention with the specificity required for implementation intention formation. Not a general plan for the day, but the single most important behavioral act of the following day, the one that most directly advances the primary objective, stated in terms of when it will begin, in what context it will occur, and what specific form it will take. Mental rehearsal and behavioral conditioning. Mental rehearsal, the deliberate, vivid internal simulation of a specific behavior or performance, has a well-established effect on actual behavioral execution. This effect is not limited to physical performance, though it is most extensively documented in athletic and motor skill contexts. Research on cognitive rehearsal in professional, academic, and interpersonal performance contexts consistently shows that the deliberate mental simulation of a behavior activates many of the same neural pathways as the actual physical performance of that behavior, strengthening the associated neural circuits and making the actual execution more fluent. The relevant mechanism involves the motor and premotor cortical regions, which show activation during vivid mental rehearsal of actions in ways that closely parallel their activation during actual physical execution. This means that the brain is not simply imagining the behavior during mental rehearsal. It is partially performing it at a neural level each time the rehearsal is conducted. The behavioral consequence is a reduction in the novelty and difficulty of the actual execution, not because the task itself has become easier, but because the neural pathways required for its execution have been partially pre-established through rehearsal. In the pre-sleep context, mental rehearsal serves a specific and practical function. It converts the behavioral intentions formed during the evening planning process from abstract plans into rehearsed performances, increasing the probability that they will be executed fluently and with appropriate behavioral characteristics when the relevant moment arrives. The practice requires specificity and vividness. A brief, detailed internal simulation of the primary behavioral intention for the following day, picturing the specific context, the specific actions involved, the specific responses to likely challenges or distractions, and the specific completion of the task, activates the rehearsal mechanism more effectively than a vague mental review of plans. This simulation should be conducted with particular attention to the points of likely difficulty or distraction, the specific moments at which the intention is most likely to be disrupted by competing demands, environmental interruptions, or motivational fluctuation. Mentally rehearsing the specific response to these predictable challenges, how the distraction will be noticed and redirected, how the motivational dip will be managed, how the task will be resumed after an interruption, creates neural preparation for exactly the situations that most reliably derail behavioral follow-through in the absence of such preparation. The 5 cognitive habits described in this examination do not produce their most significant effects in isolation or from occasional application. Their value is compounding and cumulative, dependent on the consistency with which they are applied rather than the intensity of any single application. This distinction between consistency and intensity is one of the most important and most consistently misunderstood aspects of behavioral performance development. The brain builds neural pathways through repetition. Consistent, repeated activation of a specific cognitive pattern across many instances produces a more robust and more automatic neural representation of that pattern than occasional intense activation of the same pattern across a few instances. This means that a brief, genuine 5-minute application of the pre-sleep cognitive habits described here, practiced every night, produces more durable behavioral change over 3 months than an intensive 60-minute application practice twice a week over the same period. The frequency of activation is the primary driver of neural consolidation, not the duration or intensity of individual sessions. The implication for implementation is significant. These habits should not be approached as elaborate rituals that require perfect conditions and substantial time. They should be approached as brief, consistent cognitive practices that take place regardless of how the day went, regardless of energy level, and regardless of whether the application in any given evening feels particularly effective. The cumulative effect of consistent application is what produces the behavioral change. Individual evenings of imperfect application contribute to that cumulative effect as long as they occur. There is also a second-order compounding effect that develops as these habits become more established. The cognitive practices described here, goal anchoring, emotional reappraisal, self-concept reinforcement, decision resolution, and behavioral intention setting, each reinforce the effectiveness of the others when practiced together. A clearly anchored goal provides specific content for the self-concept reinforcement practice. Emotional reappraisal of the day's difficulties provides material for the decision resolution practice. Implementation intentions build directly on the cognitive anchor established at the beginning of the pre-sleep sequence. Over time, the combined practice does not simply produce 5 separate behavioral effects. It produces an integrated cognitive orientation in which purpose, emotional regulation, self-concept, decision clarity, and behavioral intention operate as a coherent system rather than as separate efforts, a system in which each element supports and amplifies the others. The quality of cognitive functioning that this system produces is not dramatic or sudden. It develops gradually, in the same way that any skill or physical capability develops through consistent practice. The person applying it 3 months from now will not be able to identify a specific day on which something changed. They will be able to identify, looking back across the period, that their decision-making has become more consistent, their behavioral follow-through has improved, their emotional response to difficulty has become more regulated, and their clarity of purpose has become more durable, and they will have the cognitive explanation for why. The brain responds to what it is consistently given. Give it directed, structured, purposeful cognitive content in the window before sleep, consistently and over time, and it builds the neural architecture that makes directed, structured, purposeful behavior progressively more automatic and progressively less effortful. That is not a promise. It is a description of a mechanism. And mechanisms respond to consistent application regardless of whether the person applying them fully believes in the outcome at the beginning. The belief follows the results. The results follow the practice. And the practice begins tonight. The argument made throughout this examination rests on a straightforward premise. The brain is a pattern-building system, and the patterns it builds are determined largely by what cognitive inputs it receives most consistently, most repeatedly, and in the conditions of greatest neurological receptivity. The pre-sleep window meets every criterion for high-impact input delivery. It is a period of natural neurological receptivity, occurring immediately before the brain's primary consolidation cycle. It is a period in which the critical filtering functions of conscious analysis are reduced, allowing cognitive content to be received with greater depth. And it is a period that occurs every single day, providing the consistency of repetition that neural pattern building requires. Most people use this window carelessly. They fill it with passive consumption, with unmanaged rumination, with the emotional residue of a day that was never properly reviewed and organized. And the brain dutifully consolidates that careless input, strengthening the neural architecture of scattered attention, reactive emotional response, and undefined behavioral patterns. The 5 habits described here, cognitive anchoring, emotional state regulation, self-concept reinforcement, decision resolution, and behavioral intention setting, are not complex or time-consuming. They do not require special tools or significant additional time in an already full day. They require approximately 15 to 20 minutes of consistent, directed cognitive practice in a window that already exists and that is already influencing the brain's development, whether or not the person occupying it is aware of that fact. The only variable is whether that influence is being directed or left to default. Managing that variable is among the most practical and highest return cognitive investments available, not because it produces dramatic overnight results, but because it consistently redirects a daily process that is already occurring. The brain's nightly consolidation and pattern reinforcement cycle, from one that randomly strengthens whatever the day happened to leave behind into one that systematically builds the cognitive architecture that better thinking, better decisions, and more consistent behavioral performance require. Apply these practices tonight. Apply them again tomorrow night. Continue without requiring early evidence of dramatic change. The mechanism does not need belief to operate. It needs consistency. And consistency, in the context of a daily practice that costs 20 minutes and produces compounding cognitive returns, is entirely within reach.